Dratnos, your Pock is looking a little bit underwhelming this week. Have you been doing your Zereth Mortis to be able to buff him up?
Oh no, I might have forgotten to go do my cipher dailies this week. How far behind am
However,
I going to be in my raid power?
well, Dratnos, we got great news. So, if you have not been paying attention, Zereth Mortis and the Cypher are, at this point, seemingly completely optional, with at least just there's no player power attached to how the Cypher ends up functioning. There is, of course, like a Celestial Forge that will give you access to things such as like creating tier pieces, double legendaries. Not much is known about that yet. But the Cypher and the Zone of Zereth Mortis seems like, at least at this point, like there's no player power that will impact you for dungeons, raids, or PvP. And if you have no interest in exploring Zereth Mortis, this system can presumably be skipped in its entirety.
Yeah, so there's 4 talent trees that you get the ciphers of the first ones to research into, and it sort of starts off with this like intro to all 4 of the talent trees, and then for each of the different types, which they each have their own kind of like specializations in how they help you in the outdoor world. They
Yeah.
then have like an advanced talent tree as well. That if you scroll further down, you can see all the like advanced ones, and all of these are use the ciphers to research. And there's like one talent tree for core systems, one for console upgrades, one for wildlife control, and one for Pock
Customization.
upgrades.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of different cool ways to make you stronger out in Zereth Mortis. None of these have any effect on raid power, on dungeon power, anything like that.
I think overall, I think that this is actually. I'm interested to see how this ends up being, because so far for this expansion, we've had the Maw, and we've had Korthia, which have both locked some amount of player power behind, and it's just them making Zereth Mortis be like this optional content where you're able to farm things such as mounts or toys or whatever. This seems like in a very interesting direction for potentially even the future of like how outdoor content works. Because there's always
Yeah,
been some form of like AP grind that was mandatory in conjunction with world quests, and that got kind of changed coming into this expansion. But the Maw was still mandatory, even though the world quests and like the gosh, what is the AP for this called?
anima.
The anima power. That's exactly what it is. The anima, even though the anima was completely optional, the Maw was still heavily
Yeah, the Maw and
encouraged.
Korthia, both like power-oriented systems. It does look like they're looking to go a different direction with Zereth Mortis, which there is some precedent for systems being not tied to power in previous expansions, right? Systems like the Argent Tournament Grounds, I'm pretty sure you didn't need to do that if you were raid geared. And it's just like you get catch-up gear out of it. And similarly, they've talked about like from Zereth Mortis, it's going to be possible to get like 249 gear, which is already obsolete if you're a Mythic Raider in Sanctum, and will be obsolete if you're a normal Raider or a +5 Keystoner in 9.2. One thing though, I mean, look at that screenshot, Tettles. Are those two walking on water? That I've never seen that before. That's mind blowing.
I,
Incredible.
I bet they had a shaman walk up and give them both water
No, there's
walking.
no that. I mean that I've never seen that before. That is remarkable.
But yeah, I think overall, I'm interested to see just like down the line how we end up feeling about Zereth Mortis. Did it end up feeling worse because there was no player power attached to it? Did it end up feeling better because you didn't feel like you were always obligated to complete like a 6-week full grind to be able to catch up on alts and that kind of stuff? Because there were some things that were talked about in a like in an interview that were talking about like very early catch ups, kind of similar to the Echoes and Iolotha, and just baking in these systems that allowed you to play your alts a little bit faster. And in addition to that, with Zereth Mortis not having any power attached to it, that means that you don't have to phone it in 8 weeks in advance before you want to play an alt.
Yeah, so we still don't know the specifics of how you unlock the like ability to get your double legendaries, right? Your
Mm-hmm.
legendary belt with your covenant legendary. How you unlock the ability to upgrade tier sets. There is a chance that some outdoor world, Zereth Mortis even could be involved with that. It's just the cipher system is not at all tied to that or to pet player power, but there might be still some element of Zereth Mortis either being able to speed that up, right, being one optional part of many ways to gain like the cosmic flux, I think, or even being required to also like to unlock to do some quests to unlock the forge or whatever. That data is still not available. How all that's going to work?
Yep. So we're gonna see how the Cosmic Forge ends up working out in a few patches. However, one of the biggest things that I think that has come out in the past couple of weeks is how PTR raid testing is going to be working for this tier and how that impacts players. Like, you and I just got finished doing raid testing right before we ended up recording this. I thought the bosses were pretty cool. Did you have much to say about them?
Yeah, so we tested the second boss and the sixth boss, right? Dosegni and Skrillex, and they're the first one. It was like it had some cool mechanics. It was a stunning zone, though, was the main thing. Like, is the raid looked beautiful, looked massive. There wasn't any trash in there yet, but the fights themselves looked pretty stunning. And then the second fight was like a sandworm in you know a zone that looked sort of like Guardian of the First One's fight, obviously, because that's what the first one's architecture is going to look like. So I thought they both looked good, and there were cool and fun mechanics in both the fights. I'm excited about them so far.
Yeah, so I think that I would tend to agree with that. However, something that was interesting about the PTR testing for this cycle for the raids themselves is the fact that Morgan Day in an interview said that they would very much like to not raid test the final three bosses of the raid as a whole. So whenever we were talking about this last video that we made, we talked about how the raid, you were going to progress all the way into Anduin. Anduin was going to be the final boss on the first week for heroic and normal, and then after that there was going to be the final three bosses of the 11 boss raid instance unlocked that you were going to be able to do. And then in an interview with Morgan Day, the Starting Zone podcast had Morgan implied and said that if they can get away with it, they would really like to not raid test the final three bosses of this new raid. And that is something that caught people off guard. It made people happy, but it also, there is a little bit of skepticism is how I would describe some of the choices that were kind of floated with that. Would you agree with that?
Yes. So the story for me even begins before this interview, which was as soon as they announced the time gating component of Anduin being the last boss that was available on Heroic Week, people immediately started speculating and asking for not testing the three that were after Anduin. And then in this interview, they talked a little bit more about that being something they were hoping to do, which I think is very exciting for as much as we just had a lot of fun on PTR testing those bosses, I think we'd have even more fun if the raid was entirely unknown and you set foot in there for the first time on your live character instead of on a, buggy PTR character with all these items, and you started bashing up against these bosses for the first time without having known about them before.
The
But
downside is definitely the fact, like you alluded to, the bugs. So there are
right.
bugs during the PTR testing, and those are expected, right? It is expected that the fights are going to be buggy. There was a boss that was evading a little bit for us when we were testing it. That is expected. Whenever bosses are not tested, you really need to, like, the bosses that are untested really need to make sure that there are no bugs with them. And I think that that's one of the biggest things that I am, at least personally, concerned about. Like, if they are able to pull it off and we are able to go into these final three bosses fairly blind on all difficulties, that's going to be super cool. However, if they're buggy messes, then I think that's going to just completely ruin the experience for me personally. And I think that that is something that if Blizzard is going to be doing this, they need to make sure that these bosses are not buggy.
Right. Yeah. So the idea of not testing any of the three last bosses on any difficulty is a huge, huge lack of pressure, right? It's like driving a car that hasn't been crash tested, right? Like it means that as PTR testers, it's great that we don't have to go and be those crash test dummies on those bosses, but then we just have to actually drive the actual car and see what happens, and it could be bad.
How do you think this is going to impact regular players? Just
Yeah, that's the other thing, right? Like I think if you're thinking about it, like if you're a player that's really engaged with the lore, you really like to watch the race to world first. If you're in any of those spots, I think that really adds to the value of not testing these, so that you get to have that exciting experience during the first few weeks of the tier. But if you're not a player that cares too much about that, which I imagine is most players, right? If you're just like a heroic raider, you're a heroic raider, you raid heroic with your friends, and you encounter the ninth boss of the raid, and it's a buggy mess, and you can't do that boss for the first 2 nights of Prague, and then the 11th boss is also buggy for the first 2 months of Prague or something of the raid for you. Like, is any of the are you going to be happy about the decisions to not test those bosses on your difficulty? Was there really any tangible benefit for you? I think for a lot of players, yeah, the answer is going to be they would really rather have the sweaty nerds test all the content for them and make sure it's not too buggy. Yeah.
I do tend to agree. I do think though that I think there's a large amount of players, at least now, that get a lot of their they get a lot of their experience with the Mythic raid, not just via in like entering in on Mythic difficulty, but also watching the Race to World first. I mean, we see hundreds of thousands of people watch the Race to World first whenever that's an ongoing event, and like it is a very big deal on Twitch. It's like one of the biggest things that's streamed. Basically, whenever it's live, it is one of the top events, almost exclusively for the week or a couple weeks that it's happening. And so I do think that that is something that, at least it from that perspective, it is really good. To have even casual players like have something that's like better to watch in that front.
The Race World First is really big and cool, even with raid testing right now.
Yep.
If you took that testing away and the Race to World First became much buggier, right? And we were seeing like a guild just brick walled for, we've seen guilds take 6 hours of doing something different, right? Like limit on Sludge Fist. They were like, okay, we'll come back when this bug is fixed or whatever, right? There have been some boss fights in history, like Ajara, that was just like, oh, this, we're just waiting on this to get nerfed for a couple days. And I think that those have been some of the weaker races to World First, right? When you're seeing a guild bash their head against either overtuned or buggy content. And it's less about, they tested this for an hour on heroic on PTR and that's hurt the experience, right? Like I don't think that necessarily tangibly will make the Race to World First that much better to keep that a secret, right? Maybe the last boss, but the last boss is already not tested on Mythic. And I think if it became much buggier / much less well tuned, that could in fact have a much more negative effect on the race.
Yeah, there's also other impacts on the Race to World First, like boss mods not being, not even just for like Race to World First competitors, even for casual players. They're not going to be like up-to-date boss mods whenever you first enter into those. They're not going to be up-to-date weak aura packs. I know that a lot of people will just download a weak aura pack from Relo or just one of the random ones from Wago whenever they're going into the raid on normal or on heroic that first week, and just utilizing either base boss mods or base weak aura packs that are at least have some timers available for the players. But without those being available, it not only impacts the Race to World First players, but it also impacts the average players. Additionally, there's going to be a lack of practice specifically for the Race to World First people.
I don't think that that 1 hour practice is that big of a deal, because especially the end bosses come out pretty different than they were tested, right? Like if you look at like the versions of Kel'Thuzad and SLG that we tested, right, and the versions that we fought, right, the versions of Fate Scribe, all of the testing, obviously it's very valuable to get that hour, and much of the value as well is thinking about like what classes and specs are going to be good. And even still though, they're hugely different when they actually come out. I'm not sure. I think my point to this is that like the benefits that are attributed to PTR testing of making the tuning good, making the making the tuning better, making the bugginess better, those are important benefits. And if they're sacrificing much of those at all, it's probably not worth to leave these bosses untested.
I do think that you and I are on the same page here, where it's like if they are able to pull it off and the bosses are not tuned poorly and they're not buggy, this is probably the best case scenario, right? If PTR testing does not have to happen and there is a certain level of like blind progression that you're going to have going through this, or just like unknown variables with how the fights are working, this is probably the best case scenario. And I do think that it is pretty good. Blizzard needs to make 100% sure that the fight is not just a buggy mess, though. All of them.
Yeah, so far they've looked pretty good, though. The two that we've tested today, the second and sixth bosses, like, yeah, the second boss evaded a bit on a couple of pulls, but
wasn't that bad.
There wasn't like it wasn't like buggy PTR testing, right? It felt like testing release candidate bosses, basically, which is exactly a good sign for the first round of testing. The first round of testing in Castle Nathria, I think one of the testings was like canceled entirely. One of the bosses was just bugged beyond belief. So definitely encouraging.
Retesting bosses 4 times and stuff like that.
That was SLG. Yeah, Stone Legion Generals was tested 4 times, and then they released a version that was worse than any of the 4 that had been tested.
All right. Anyways, that's going to be it for us today. Are you guys looking forward towards not testing the final 3 bosses and like what unknown variables those behold? Or do you think that this is going to be more problematic than it is worth? I'm interested to see what people down in the comment section have to say about it. Because, I mean, obviously, you and I, we cast the race roll first. Things like this excite us because there is like this level of unknown where we're going to see for like the first time on Mythic some of these fights, and we're not really going to know what the mechanics are doing, and we're going to have to watch through with the people. So I think that you and I find it interesting. I wonder what the more casual, more average player feels about this. Anything else you got to say, Dratnos?
Yeah, do let us know. Comment in the Wowhead comments. Comment in the YouTube comments. Hit us up for the algorithm, and we'll see you
Yeah,
next week.
please. Goodbye.